Disappointment. That's all you've ever been. Those were the words my father spat at me as we stood beside my mother's casket. Not in private, not in a whisper, but loud enough for every mourner in that funeral home to hear. Before I jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My knees nearly buckled as his cold eyes bore into mine, his perfectly pressed black suit a stark contrast to the chaos he'd just unleashed in that solemn room. I felt dozens of eyes shift toward us, the uncomfortable silence that followed more suffocating than my grief. Catherine deserved better than a daughter who couldn't even make it home for her final days. But that's you, Emma. Always putting yourself first. I never thought I'd share this story publicly, but sometimes healing comes from speaking your truth. My name is Emma Wilson. 3 months ago, I buried my mother after a battle with cancer that took her far too quickly. 2 weeks ago, I discovered who she really believed I was, despite the narrative my father had crafted about me my entire life. But let me back up. That day at the funeral home, as my father's words hung in the air, I didn't collapse. I didn't scream back. I simply turned and walked out, past the flower arrangements my mother would have found too ostentatious, past relatives who suddenly found the floor fascinating, past my step-siblings Tyler and Megan who wore matching expressions of artificial sympathy. I made it to my car before the tears came, hot and relentless down my cheeks. The truth was, I had been there during Mom's final days, sitting beside her hospital bed while Dad was handling arrangements. I'd read to her from her favorite poetry collection, applied lip balm to her parched lips, and held her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. But I'd gone home to shower and change clothes the morning she passed. 47 minutes. That's how long I was gone when she took her final breath. Dad had arrived just in time to see her go, and somehow, in his mind, that transformed into me abandoning her. It wasn't the first time he'd painted me as the villain in our family's story. It was just the most public. After the burial, there was a reading of the will scheduled at Mr. Harrison's law office downtown. I almost didn't go. What was the point? Mom had always deferred to Dad on financial matters. I assumed everything would go to him, with perhaps small sentimental items for me and larger assets split among the real family, my father, my stepmother Vanessa, and her children whom Dad had practically adopted as his own after their marriage 10 years ago. But Olivia, my oldest friend, wouldn't let me skip it. "You need closure, Em," she insisted, sitting on the edge of my bed in the small apartment I'd rented for my stay in Portland. "Besides, your mom might have left you. Her jewelry or books, things that matter." So I went, walking into that gleaming downtown high-rise feeling like an imposter. The conference room was all mahogany and leather, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city my mother had loved. Dad sat at the head of the table, naturally, with Vanessa to his right, then Tyler and Megan. I took a seat at the opposite end, as far from them as possible. Mr. Harrison, Mom's lawyer of 20 years, nodded at me with something that looked almost like anticipation in his eyes. He arranged his papers, cleared his throat, and began reading the formal legal language that would distribute my mother's earthly possessions. "To my husband, Richard Wilson," he read, "I leave the sum of $10,000. The room went still. 10,000? From a woman whose family had built one of the largest private real estate firms in the Pacific Northwest. Dad's face tightened, but he maintained his composure, clearly expecting more to follow. "To my stepchildren, Tyler and Megan Johnson, I leave $5,000 each, with my sincere wishes for your future happiness." Megan's mouth fell open. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand gripped her purse until her knuckles whitened. "To my daughter, Emma Catherine Wilson." Mr. Harrison paused, glancing up at me over his reading glasses. I braced myself for some small token, some modest memento that would somehow confirm what my father had always implied, that I was an afterthought in my mother's heart. I leave the entirety of my personal estate, including all properties, investments and holdings in Wilson Family Enterprises, along with the following letter to be read aloud at this time. My father's face drained of color. "There must be some mistake," he interrupted, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Catherine and I had an understanding." Mr. Harrison simply shook his head and unfolded a separate piece of paper. "My dearest Emma," he began reading my mother's words. "If you're hearing this, then I've failed in my deepest wish, which was to tell you these things myself. Courage has never been my strong suit, not like you. You've always had the bravery I lacked, especially when it came to standing up to your father." I felt my chest tighten as the letter continued. "For 27 years, I've allowed Richard to diminish your light, because confronting him meant confronting my own cowardice. I watched him favor your step-siblings while finding fault in everything you achieved. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but the truth is, I was preserving my comfort at the expense of your happiness." Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the view of my father's increasingly thunderous expression. "The company that bears our family name was built primarily by my father, not Richard's, despite what he's led everyone to believe. My father left it to me with the understanding that it would one day pass to you. Richard has been merely the steward, never the owner, a fact I've allowed him to obscure even from you." The silence in the room was absolute now. Vanessa's face had gone from shock to calculation. Tyler and Megan were exchanging nervous glances. And Dad looked like a man whose entire identity was crumbling before his eyes. "I've spent the last year quietly restructuring everything to ensure Richard cannot contest this will. The documentation Mr. Harrison has prepared proves that your father has been drawing a salary from my family's company while contributing little to its actual growth. The properties he claims to have built were funded by my inheritance, not his business acumen." Mr. Harrison paused, glancing up to make sure I was still processing the words. I nodded for him to continue, my hands trembling in my lap. "The saddest truth, my sweet girl, is that your father has resented you since the day you were born. Not because of anything you did, but because my father specified that the company would pass only to my children, not to any spouse. You were the heir Richard could never be, and rather than celebrating the amazing woman you've become, he spent your lifetime trying to convince us both that you weren't worthy of your inheritance." A small, wounded sound escaped my father's throat. For the first time in my life, I saw him look genuinely afraid. "I should have protected you. Instead, I'm leaving you with the burden of unraveling the lies he's told. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm so deeply sorry, Emma. The only amends I can make is to ensure that you now have the resources to live life on your own terms, free from his manipulation. All my love, always. Mom." Mr. Harrison set down the letter and looked at my father, whose face had moved through shock and anger into something dangerously cold. "This is preposterous," Dad finally said, his voice low and controlled. "Catherine was not of sound mind during her illness. I'll be contesting this, of course." "I anticipated you might say that, Mr. Wilson," Mr. Harrison replied, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Inside, you'll find documentation of your wife's comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted 6 months ago, specifically to prevent such a challenge, along with records of the systematic way you've attempted to isolate Emma from her mother over the years." He turned to me. "Your mother was very thorough, Ms. Wilson. She compiled quite a detailed account of events dating back to your childhood." I couldn't speak. 27 years of being told I wasn't enough, not smart enough, not dedicated enough, not worthy of the Wilson name, and all along it had been fear and resentment driving my father's cruelty. Dad stood abruptly, straightening his tie with hands that weren't quite steady. We'll see what the courts have to say about this. Creative interpretation of events. He gestured for Vanessa and my step-siblings to follow him out. One moment. Mr. Wilson, Mr. Harrison called, stopping them at the door. You should be aware that attempting to contest this will trigger a clause that would reduce your settlement to $1. It also initiates an audit of company finances for the past 15 years, with particular attention to your personal expenditures. The threat hung in the air. Everyone in that room knew what such an audit would reveal. Dad had always lived beyond even our family's considerable means, and I'd overheard enough conversations over the years to know he'd taken liberties with company funds. Without another word, he stormed out, Vanessa hurrying after him with Tyler, and Megan trailing behind like lost ducklings. The heavy door swung shut, leaving me alone with Mr. Harrison and the echo of my mother's posthumous courage. There's more, Mr. Harrison said gently once we were alone. Your mother left a private letter and some personal items that she didn't want read in front of the others. He handed me a sealed envelope and a small jewelry box. Inside the box was my grandmother's sapphire ring, the one Dad had given, to Vanessa years ago, claiming it was a family piece from his side. Somehow, Mom had gotten it back. Take some time, Mr. Harrison advised. This is a lot to process. The company will continue running in the interim. Your mother put a solid management team in place. When you're ready to discuss next steps, call me. I nodded numbly, clutching the envelope and box as I left the office. Instead of going back to my rented apartment, I found myself driving to the botanical garden where Mom and I used to spend Sunday afternoons when I was little, before Dad's resentment had poisoned our family dynamic, before Vanessa and her children, before Mom became a shadow of herself. I sat on our favorite bench near the koi pond and opened the private letter with shaking hands. Emma, my brave girl, it began. By now you know the truth about the inheritance, but there's something more important I need you to understand. The wealth isn't your true legacy, your compassion is. Despite how your father treated you, you never became cruel or bitter. You built a life helping others through your work, while he spent his life accumulating things and status. I thought about my modest apartment in Boston, my job as a social worker that Dad had always belittled as charity work, the simple life I'd built that had never seemed adequate in his eyes. I've made arrangements for you to meet with people who can help you understand the business, should you choose to take it on. But know this. Whether you sell everything and use the money to further your work with vulnerable children, or whether you step into leading the company and transform it according to your values, I trust you completely. Tears splashed onto the paper as I continued reading. The day you were born was the best day of my life, despite what your father may have told you. You were never a disappointment. You were always my greatest pride. I'm sorry I didn't tell you that every single day. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you the way you deserved. Forgive me if you can, but more importantly, believe this truth. You are, and always have been, enough. I sat in that garden until sunset, reading and rereading my mother's words, feeling decades of doubt and inadequacy begin to crack and crumble. The next morning, I called Olivia. I'm not going back to Boston yet, I told her. I need to understand what Mom left me, not just the assets, but the responsibility. Whatever you need, she replied. Want company while you figure it out? That was Olivia, steadfast, uncomplicated in her support, the opposite of the conditional love I'd grown up with. Actually, yes, I said, surprising myself with the answer. I think I do. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings with executives, tours of properties I'd never known my family owned, and evenings spent poring over company history with Olivia's patient help. I learned that my grandfather had built the company from nothing, that my mother had quietly guided many of its most successful ventures, and that my father had primarily contributed a talent for taking credit and looking the part of a successful businessman. I didn't hear from Dad directly, But through various channels, I learned he and Vanessa had abruptly moved to Arizona, where her parents lived. Tyler and Megan had reached out, awkwardly attempting to maintain connections now that the family power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. I kept those conversations brief but civil. Their opportunism wasn't surprising, but I didn't have the energy to navigate complex relationships with people who had witnessed my father's treatment of me for years without ever speaking up. 1 month after the will reading, I found myself standing in my mother's home office, now my office, in the house I'd grown up in. Dad had cleared out his belongings with remarkable efficiency once it became clear the property was legally mine. I'd decided to move back in, not out of triumph, but because somewhere beneath the painful memories lay the faint outline of happier times that I wasn't quite ready to let go. I was sorting through old photographs when I found it. A picture of Mom holding me as a newborn, her face radiant with joy. On the back, in her elegant handwriting, Emma's first day, the beginning of everything good. All those years he'd told me she'd had difficult birth, that I'd been a challenging baby, that I'd disrupted her career plans and their marriage. But here was evidence of a different truth, preserved in a moment of pure love. I pinned that photo to the bulletin board above the desk as my phone rang. It was Mr. Harrison. "Emma," he said when I answered, "there's something I think you should know. Your father is trying to approach some of the company's long-standing clients directly. He's suggesting the business is in inexperienced hands." I felt the old familiar sting of his dismissal, followed by something new, a steely certainty that this time I wouldn't absorb the blow in silence. "Thank you for letting me know," I replied calmly. "Please draft a cease and desist letter immediately and schedule a meeting with our top 20 clients for next week. It's time I introduced myself properly." As I hung up, I looked at the photo of my mother again and whispered, "I hear you, Mom. I'm enough. I've always been enough." The company quarterly meeting was scheduled for the following week, the first one since I'd taken ownership. Standing at the podium facing a room full of employees who had known my father as the face of Wilson Family Enterprises for decades, I felt a moment of that old self-doubt creeping in. Then I remembered my mother's letter, took a deep breath, and began. "For those who don't know me, I'm Emma Wilson. My mother, Catherine Wilson, founded this company with her father, though some of you may have heard a different version of that story." Murmurs rippled through the audience. I continued, "I'm not here to dwell on the past, but to chart our future. My background isn't in real estate development, it's in social work. That perspective might seem irrelevant to business, but I've spent my career understanding what people need, helping them navigate complex systems, and building trust in difficult circumstances." I paused, looking out at faces that registered everything from skepticism to curiosity. "In the coming months, you'll see changes. We'll be launching an affordable housing division. We'll be revising our environmental impact standards. And we'll be implementing the profit-sharing program my mother designed but never had the opportunity to introduce." By the time I finished outlining my vision, the energy in the room had transformed. People approached me afterward with ideas they'd apparently been sitting on for years, innovations my father had dismissed as unnecessary or too idealistic. That night, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, looking at the garden my mother had tended so carefully. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You'll run that company into the ground within a year. Some people aren't built for success." Dad. Of course he couldn't resist one final jab. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked the number, set down my phone, and turned my attention back to the garden, where the first spring bulbs were pushing through the soil. Persistent, resilient, right on schedule. 3 months after my mother's funeral, I stood in the botanical garden that had been our special place, finalizing details for the Catherine Wilson Memorial Pavilion, a new education center focused on environmental sustainability, funded by the company she'd built and the daughter she'd believed in, even when she couldn't say it aloud. As I watched the architect gesturing toward where the building would stand, my phone rang. It was Olivia. "How'd the client meeting go?" she asked. She'd become not just my emotional support, but my unofficial business advisor, her practical intelligence, the perfect complement to my learning curve. "We got the contract," I told her, unable to keep the pride from my voice. "The biggest one we've bid on since I took over." "Of course you did," she said, and I could hear her smile. "You're Emma Wilson. You were built for this." The words hit me differently than they might have months earlier. Built for this. Not because I was a Wilson by name, or because business acumen ran in my blood, but because I brought something unique to the table, compassion alongside capability, ethics alongside ambition. "You know what?" I replied, watching a monarch butterfly land on a nearby flower. "I think I was." As I walk through the company offices today, photos of my mother and grandfather hang alongside our mission statement, one that prioritizes community impact alongside profit margins. Dad's portrait has been quietly removed, though I keep it in storage rather than destroying it. Someday, I might be healed enough to look at it without feeling that old familiar ache of never measuring up. My father still lives in Arizona. I hear he started a small consulting business, though former clients tell me it's struggling to gain traction. I don't wish him failure, but I don't lose sleep over his challenges either. Some lessons come late in life, and his might be learning that the power he wielded so carelessly was never really his to begin with. As for me, I'm learning too. How to lead with both strength and empathy. How to honor my mother's legacy while creating my own. How to recognize my worth without needing anyone else's validation. Sometimes, late at night, in the house where I grew up feeling invisible, I imagine my mother watching as I transform the company she protected for me. I like to think she'd be proud, not just of what I'm building, but of who I've become. A woman who knows exactly what she's worth. That day at the funeral, when my father called me worthless in front of everyone we knew, he thought he was delivering a final verdict on my life. He couldn't have known he was actually setting the stage for me to discover just how wrong he'd always been. About the company, about my mother, about me. Some inheritances aren't measured in dollars or property, deeds. Some are found in the truth that finally breaks through years of lies. Some are discovered in the moment you realize you never needed anyone's permission to know your own value. That's the real inheritance my mother left me. And it's worth everything. I spent the week after the reading of Mom's will in a daze, alternating between numbness and overwhelming emotion. The revelation that my mother had secretly been protecting her family's legacy for me all these years shattered everything I thought I knew about our family dynamics. Each night, I'd fall asleep clutching her private letter, the words blurring as I read them over and over until they were practically memorized. "You are, and always have been, enough." Such simple words, yet they felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. The weight of what she'd left me was staggering, not just financially, but emotionally. The Wilson Family Enterprises headquarters occupied a sleek building downtown, housing over 100 employees who now, technically, worked for me. The thought was so absurd I almost laughed when Mr. Harrison mentioned it during our follow-up meeting 2 days after the will reading. "Your mother left detailed instructions," he explained, spreading documents across his polished desk. "She's arranged for a transition team to guide you through everything, should you choose to take on leadership of the company." "And if I don't?" I asked, the possibility of walking away from all of it suddenly appealing. "I could sell everything, donate half to causes my father would hate, use the rest to live comfortably while continuing my social work. The ultimate rebellion." Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses. "Then the company would be sold according to guidelines," Catherine established. "But," he added, studying me carefully, She hoped you wouldn't make that decision immediately. She felt that understanding what she built might help you understand her better. Something in his tone made me pause. Did you know her well? I was her friend for 30 years, he said softly. Long before I became the family attorney. I watched her struggle with the choice between keeping peace with your father and protecting you. It wasn't a simple situation, Ms. Wilson. I felt a flash of anger, unexpected and hot. Simple? No. But standing up for your child should be instinctive, shouldn't it? Why did she let him treat me that way for so long? Mr. Harrison sighed, removing his glasses. Without them, he looked older, wearier. Your mother came from wealth, but also from dysfunction. Her own father was controlling in different ways. She learned early that direct confrontation rarely ended well for her. With Richard, she chose a more strategic approach. Strategic? I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Is that what we're calling decades of allowing emotional abuse now? Emma, he said, using my first name for the first time. I'm not defending her choices. But consider this. By the time she realized the depth of your father's resentment toward you, they were already married with a young child. He controlled the public narrative about their marriage, their business dealings, everything. Had she left him then, he would have made sure she lost custody of you. The revelation hit me like ice water. How do you know that? Because he threatened it directly. Catherine consulted me privately when you were 7. Richard had discovered she was making arrangements to leave him and take you with her. He made it clear that if she tried, he would use his influence to paint her as unstable, unfit. In those days, his connections in the legal community were considerable. I closed my eyes, a memory surfacing. Mom crying in the garden after what I'd always thought was just another of their arguments. Her suddenly redecorating the house, throwing herself into making things perfect. The way she'd started teaching me to placate Dad, to avoid triggering his disappointment. It had never made sense until now. So instead, she stayed and let him chip away at my self-worth? My voice cracked despite my effort to keep it steady. Instead, she documented everything, built her own network of allies, restructured the company slowly, carefully, making sure he couldn't touch the core assets that were rightfully hers. And most importantly, she made sure you had opportunities to build your own life away from his influence. He slid another folder toward me. Your college fund that he didn't know about. The apartment in Boston she helped you secure through a shell company when you got your first job. The anonymous donations to the nonprofit where you work. My breath caught. That was her? He nodded. Catherine played a long game, Emma. Not because she was weak, but because she was determined that one day you would have everything without him being able to take it away. I sat back, feeling the anger drain away, replaced by a complicated grief. She'd been fighting for me all along, just not in the way I'd needed most. Openly, visibly standing between me and my father's constant criticism. There's one more thing, Mr. Harrison said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small silver key. Your mother kept a private office, separate from both her home study and her company office. No one but her had access. Not even your father. She left instructions that only you should enter it after she was gone. The key felt impossibly heavy in my palm. Where? There's a converted carriage house behind the Hawthorne property. The Queen Anne Victorian your grandfather left her. I knew the house, of course. It sat on a tree-lined street in the historic district, but I'd only been inside a handful of times growing up. Dad had always claimed it was being renovated or leased out. Another lie, apparently. That afternoon, I drove to the address with Olivia beside me for moral support. The main house was grand, but not ostentatious, painted a soft blue with white trim and a wraparound porch. Behind it, partially, hidden by mature oak trees, stood a smaller structure that matched the architectural style of the main house. "You don't have to do this today," Olivia said gently as we approached the carriage house. "It's been an overwhelming week." "I need to know," I replied, the key already in my hand. "I need to understand who she really was." The lock turned, smoothly, as if recently oiled. Inside, sunlight filtered through leaded glass windows, illuminating a space that took my breath away. It wasn't just an office. It was a sanctuary. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on business, art, philosophy. A beautiful desk faced the windows, everything arranged with meticulous care. But what stopped me in my tracks were the walls. They were covered with photographs of me. Every school play, graduation, award ceremony, moments I hadn't even realized she'd attended. And interspersed among them were my achievements, framed articles I'd written for my college paper, a citation for volunteer work I'd done in Boston, the program from a fundraiser where I'd given a speech for the nonprofit. "Oh, Emma," Olivia whispered beside me. I moved through the space in a daze, touching things that had mattered to my mother. On her desk sat a leather portfolio embossed with my initials. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me, dated over the years, none ever sent. I picked up one dated from my 16th birthday. "My darling Emma," it began. "Today you turned 16, looking so beautiful in that blue dress, reminding me of myself at your age. Your father said your grades this term were disappointing, but I saw your report card. Straight A's except for that one B in calculus, a subject that never came easily to me either. I wanted to tell you how proud I am, how that B represents harder work than any easy A. I wanted to stand up at dinner and say, 'Our daughter is exceptional,' but instead, I watched you shrink under his criticism, and I made creme brulee, your C, favorite, as a poor substitute for the courage I couldn't find. Forgive me. Someday, I hope to be as brave as you already are." Tears blurred my vision as I sat heavily in her chair. Letter after letter chronicled my life through her eyes. A mother who had seen me clearly, loved me fiercely, and failed me consistently in the one way that had mattered most. Her words painted a picture of a woman trapped between fear and devotion, making the wrong choice for what she believed were the right reasons. "She was planning to tell you everything," Olivia said softly, holding up a calendar she'd found on a side table. The date of Mom's diagnosis was circled, and after it, in neat handwriting, "Time to tell Emma the truth." But cancer had progressed faster than anyone expected. By the time I'd flown home from Boston, she was already in the hospital, her lucidity coming and going. Even then, she'd tried. I remembered now a moment I'd dismissed as medication-induced confusion when she'd gripped my hand and whispered, "The business is yours. Always was. Don't let him tell you different." I'd soothed her, thinking she was disoriented. "Don't worry about any of that now, Mom. Just rest." On her desk, next to a framed photo of me as a toddler in her arms, sat a business card for a therapist, Dr. Eleanor Winters, with an appointment scheduled for the day after Mom had been rushed to the hospital, the last appointment she'd never keep. "She was trying to get help," I murmured, running my finger over the embossed lettering. "To find her voice." "Too late," Olivia said, then immediately looked contrite. "I'm sorry, that wasn't fair." "No, you're right," I replied, surprising myself with how calm I felt. It was too late for her to fix what happened between us, but maybe not too late for me to understand it. As the afternoon light shifted through the windows, I continued exploring the space that had been my mother's true home. In a filing cabinet, neatly organized, I found records of every manipulative business move my father had ever made, alongside evidence of how Mom had quietly countered each one. Diverted funds restored. Attempts to sell family properties blocked through legal maneuvering. A letter from my grandfather before his death, warning her about Richard's character and advising her to protect the company's legacy. She was playing chess while he thought they were playing checkers, Olivia observed, peering over my shoulder at a particularly complex diagram of corporate restructuring. And I was just a pawn, I said, the realization settling heavily. To both of them, in different ways. No, Olivia corrected firmly. To your father, maybe. But to her? She gestured around the room, at the shrine of maternal pride disguised as an office. You were the queen she was protecting, even if she did it all wrong. I stayed in that room until sunset, reading letters, examining photographs, absorbing the reality of a mother I'd never fully known. When I finally locked the door behind us, I felt different. Not healed exactly, but changed. The narrative of my childhood had been rewritten, not erasing the pain, but contextualizing it in ways that made my heart ache with a different kind of grief. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I found myself standing in the kitchen of my mother's house, my house now, staring at the gleaming granite countertops she'd chosen during the last renovation. How many mornings had she stood in this exact spot, planning her careful strategy for the day? How many meals had she prepared here while carrying the weight of her secrets? On impulse, I opened her home office, the formal one my father had occasionally used as well. It felt sterile compared to her private sanctuary, with its matching furniture sets and impersonal art chosen to impress visitors. But even here, I found small rebellions. A drawer locked with a key hidden inside a hollow book. On the shelf, containing copies of my school photos my father had refused to display. A small sapphire paperweight that matched the ring she'd reclaimed from Vanessa. Tiny declarations of independence hidden in plain sight. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, breaking the silence. The house on Hawthorne Street was never yours to claim. Another example of you taking what isn't earned. My father, with a new number. I should have expected it. He'd never been one to surrender gracefully, and in his mind, my mother's decision to leave me her inheritance was nothing but a personal betrayal, not the correction of his decades-long attempt to divert what had never been his. This time, I didn't just block the number. I took a screenshot, saved it to a folder labeled Richard Wilson, and made a note to share it with Mr. Harrison. Each harassment attempt was another brick in the wall between my father and any remaining claim he might try to make on my mother's estate. The morning brought unexpected clarity. Over coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood come to life, I made a decision. I called Mr. Harrison. I want to meet the transition team, I said when he answered, and I want copies of all company records for the past 20 years. You're taking it on, then? He asked, though he didn't sound surprised. I'm considering it, I replied carefully. But first, I need to understand exactly what my father's been doing all these years. And then I need to decide what kind of leader I might be. Your mother would be pleased, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. She always said you were smarter than both of them combined. She should have told me that herself, I said, the words carrying no bitterness now, just a simple truth. Yes, he agreed softly. She should have. The following Monday, I walked into Wilson Family Enterprises for the first time as its owner. The receptionist did a double take. When I gave my name, clearly not expecting the boss's estranged daughter to appear unannounced. Word traveled fast. By the time I reached the executive floor, a visibly flustered assistant was waiting to escort me to the conference room, where the senior management team had hastily assembled. They were mostly men in their 50s and 60s, contemporaries of my father, with identical expressions of barely concealed discomfort. I recognized a few from obligatory childhood appearances at company functions, men who had patted my head dismissively before turning to ask my father about golf or investments. Ms. Wilson, the oldest one began, rising to offer his hand. James Thornton, Chief Financial Officer. We weren't expecting you today. Clearly, I replied, taking the seat at the head of the table without waiting for an invitation. But as I now own this company, I thought it was time we got acquainted. The silence that followed was delicious. These men had worked alongside my mother for years, yet I suspected none of them truly knew her. They'd seen the version she presented, competent but deferential, always careful to let my father take credit. They had no idea they'd been working for her all along. "Perhaps you could start by bringing me up to speed on current projects," I suggested, opening the notebook I'd brought along. "And then we can discuss the changes I'll be implementing." For the next 2 hours, I listened, took notes, and asked pointed questions that increasingly revealed how much had been hidden from me, and how much I'd need to learn. But with each minute that passed, something settled in my chest, a certainty that while I might not have my mother's business experience or my father's ruthless ambition, I had something equally valuable: perspective from outside their gilded cage. As the meeting concluded, Thornton lingered behind the others. "Your father always said you weren't interested in the family business," he remarked, studying me with new interest. "My father said a lot of things," I replied evenly. "Not all of them were true." He nodded slowly. "I worked with your mother for 15 years. She was more than she appeared." "So am I, Mr. Thornton." I gathered my notes and stood. "So am I." Walking out of that building into the bright spring sunshine, I felt a curious lightness. For the first time, I could see a future that wasn't defined by what my father thought of me or by my mother's silent sacrifices. Whatever I decided to do with this unexpected inheritance, run the company, sell it, transform it, would be my choice alone. That evening, I returned to the carriage house with a bottle of my mother's favorite wine and 2 glasses. I poured one for myself and one for her, setting it beside the photograph of us that had always been her favorite. Me at 5 years old, sitting on her lap in the garden, both of us laughing at something long forgotten. "I'm still angry with you," I told her image softly, "but I'm starting to understand. And I wish we'd had time for you to find your voice so I could have known who you really were." The silence that answered wasn't empty anymore. It felt like possibility. The morning I decided to move into my mother's Queen Anne Victorian was unseasonably warm for early spring. Movers carried boxes from my temporary apartment while I stood on the wraparound porch, key in hand, hesitating at the threshold that separated my past from whatever future I was stepping into. This house represented a history I'd barely been allowed to claim: my maternal grandfather's legacy, my mother's quiet rebellion, and now, my unexpected inheritance. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through stained glass panels, casting jewel-toned patterns across hardwood floors that had been recently polished. Despite my father's claims about renovations, the house was immaculate, clearly maintained with loving care. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase on the entryway table, lilies, my mother's favorite, placed there by the caretaker who'd been quietly maintaining the property for years. Without my knowledge. "Ms. Wilson," a voice called from the kitchen. An older woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun appeared, wiping her hands on an apron. "I'm Margaret. I've been looking after this place for your mother since your grandfather passed." "For 15 years?" I asked, surprised. Dad had always made it sound like the property was an investment, not a second home my mother had kept. Margaret nodded. "Catherine came here 3 times a week, sometimes more. Said it was the only place she could truly breathe." She gestured toward the back of the house. "She kept a studio upstairs. Asked me never to mention it to your father." "A studio?" The surprises kept coming. I followed Margaret up the grand staircase, past bedrooms decorated in period-appropriate furnishings, to a door at the end of the hall. Unlike the formal elegance of the rest of the house, this space was alive with color and light. An artist's studio, with canvases stacked against walls, brushes in jars, and the lingering scent of oil paint. "I didn't know she painted. whispered, taking in the dozens of completed works. Landscapes, abstracts, and most surprisingly, portraits, including several of me at different ages, painted from photographs. The quality was remarkable, showing technical skill developed over years of dedicated practice. Started right after your grandfather died, Margaret explained. Said she always wanted to, but your father thought it was a waste of time. So she made this her secret. Came here to paint while he thought she was at charity functions or spa appointments. I moved from canvas to canvas, seeing my mother's world through her eyes. The garden behind this house in different seasons, views from windows I recognized from our family home, and one striking piece of a woman standing at a crossroads. Face turned away, two paths stretching before her. Did she ever show these to anyone? I asked. Just me, and only because I cleaned in here, Margaret replied. She talked about having a show someday. After. She trailed off. After what? After she finally stood up to your father. She had a plan, you know. Was going to tell him everything once she got her affairs in order. The cancer changed the timeline. I sat heavily on a paint-splattered stool, overwhelmed by yet another glimpse of the mother I'd never truly known. A woman with hidden talents, secret ambitions, and a voice she'd only expressed in private. The mother I thought I knew had been quiet, accommodating, perpetually smoothing over my father's sharp edges. But here was evidence of a completely different person. She left a letter for you in the drawer, Margaret said, nodding toward the small desk in the corner before quietly withdrawing, giving me privacy with my mother's final secrets. The envelope was thick, the handwriting unmistakably Mom's elegant script. I broke the seal with trembling fingers. My dearest Emma, it began. If you're reading this, you've found my sanctuary. This studio has been my confession booth, my therapist's couch, and my salvation all in one. Here, I could be the person I was too afraid to be in the rest of my life. Honest, expressive, and free from your father's constant criticism. The paintings are yours now. Do with them what you will. Show them, sell them, store them away. They represent the hours I should have spent standing up for you instead of escaping into art. For that, I can never apologize enough. But there's something else I want you to have. Something that might help you understand the business better than any financial statement or corporate document. In the bottom drawer of this desk, you'll find journals dating back 30 years. My detailed observations about Wilson Family Enterprises, your grandfather's vision, and the ways your father systematically tried to dismantle that legacy for his own gain. I recorded everything, Emma. Every manipulative tactic, every underhanded deal, every time he tried to push me out of decisions about my own family's company. Reading them might be painful, but the knowledge within them is power. Power I never fully wielded in life, but which I hope will serve you well. You have always been worthy of everything I couldn't give you openly. My love, my pride, my absolute faith in your capabilities. When you were born, I promised myself I would never let you feel the kind of self-doubt my own mother instilled in me. I failed you terribly in that regard, but it's not too late for you to know your own worth. With all my heart, Mom. I pulled open the drawer she'd mentioned and found leather-bound journals stacked neatly inside, each labeled with a year. Beginning with the oldest, I opened to the first page and began reading. Hours passed as I immersed myself in my mother's private thoughts, her initial excitement about the business, her growing concerns about my father's ethics, her detailed documentation of financial maneuvers she'd made to protect the company's core assets. Interspersed among business observations were personal notes about me, pride in my achievements, worry about my father's effect on my confidence, guilt about her own complicity in his emotional manipulation. One entry from when I was 16 stood out painfully. Richard told Emma today that her academic achievements were expected, not exceptional. I watched the light dim in her eyes, that familiar look of trying to measure up to impossible standards. I said nothing at dinner, then spent the night throwing up from the shame of my silence. She deserves better than a mother who can't protect her from this slow poisoning of her spirit. By sunset, I'd read enough to understand that my mother had been waging a silent war with my father for decades, a strategic, careful campaign to preserve what mattered while appearing to surrender daily battles. In business, she'd been brilliant, always 3 steps ahead of his attempts to seize control. In our home life, she'd been paralyzed by fear of losing me entirely if she challenged him directly. The portrait that emerged was neither saint nor coward, but a complex woman trapped in her own carefully constructed compromise. She'd sacrificed her authenticity to protect the material legacy she could eventually pass to me, while sacrificing my emotional well-being in the process. I closed the last journal as darkness fell, my mind racing with implications. Together with the formal business records I'd been reviewing, these personal insights created a comprehensive map of Wilson Family Enterprises, its strengths, vulnerabilities, and unrealized potential. More importantly, they revealed exactly how my father had been operating all these years, the facade of business acumen covering increasingly desperate attempts to control assets that were never truly his. The next morning, I called Mr. Harrison with a new determination in my voice. "I need to meet with the board of directors," I said without preamble. "All of them, as soon as possible." "That can be arranged," he replied, sounding pleased. "May I ask what you're planning?" "A complete restructuring," I said firmly, starting with addressing my father's ongoing attempts to undermine my position with key clients. 2 days later, I stood before the 12-member board in the company's main conference room. Many were my father's longtime associates, men who'd benefited from the status quo and who regarded me with thinly veiled skepticism. A few were newer additions, including 2 women appointed during my mother's more recent, subtle campaign for diversification. "Thank you for meeting on such short notice," I began, dressed in a suit that conveyed the authority I was still learning to feel. "As you're aware, Wilson Family Enterprises is undergoing a significant transition. What you may not be aware of is exactly what that means going forward." I distributed folders containing the restructuring plan I'd developed, drawing on my mother's journals and my own professional experience in organizational management from my social work career. For too long, this company has operated with a public face that didn't match its private reality, I continued. The narrative that Richard Wilson built this business is, frankly, fiction. The company was founded by my grandfather and grew under my mother's guidance, with my father serving primarily as a figurehead. Murmurs rippled through the room. James Thornton, the CFO, who'd shown a glimmer of understanding during our first meeting, caught my eye and nodded slightly, encouraging me to continue. "I've spent the past 3 weeks conducting a comprehensive review of our operations, finances, and client relationships," I said, flipping open my own copy of the report. "What I've found is both concerning and promising. The concerning part is how far we've drifted from my grandfather's original vision of community-focused development. The promising part is how easily we can correct course." For the next hour, I laid out my findings, profitable but ethically questionable deals my father had pushed through, unrealized opportunities my mother had identified but never pursued, inefficiencies in our organizational structure that drained resources without adding value. Then I presented my vision for the future. A return to development projects that balanced profit with community benefit, transparent operations, and a management structure that reflected modern business practices rather than outdated hierarchies. "Ms. Wilson," one of the older board members interrupted, his tone dismissive, "while your enthusiasm is commendable, this company has operated successfully under your father's leadership for nearly 30 years. These wholesale changes seem precipitous and, frankly, naive." I smiled, having anticipated exactly this response. "I understand your concern, Mr. Blackwell, which is why I've prepared this supplementary report." I nodded to my assistant, who distributed additional documents to each board member. This details the actual performance of projects initiated under my father's leadership versus those guided by my mother, comparing profit margins, timeline adherence, and long-term value creation. The room grew quiet as they absorbed the stark differences revealed by the data. Projects my mother had quietly steered consistently outperformed my father's initiatives by significant margins. What's more, they'd done so while generating positive community impact and press, creating sustainable value rather than quick profits. Additionally, I continued into the silence, you'll find documentation of my father's current attempts to interfere with client relationships, including emails he's sent disparaging my leadership and misrepresenting his ongoing role in the company. As this constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and potentially tortious interference, our legal team has prepared cease and desist notices to be delivered this afternoon. James Thornton leaned forward, a new respect in his eyes. You've certainly done your homework, Ms. Wilson. May I ask who helped you prepare this analysis? I prepared it myself, I replied calmly. Before I devoted my career to social work, I earned dual degrees in business and psychology. Contrary to what my father may have suggested, I've always understood our family business. I simply chose a different path, until now. By the end of the meeting, I'd secured tentative board approval for the first phase of my restructuring plan. Several older members remained skeptical, but the momentum had clearly shifted. As we adjourned, one of the women on the board, Patricia Mercer, approached me privately. Your mother would be proud, she said quietly. She and I spoke occasionally about the changes she hoped to implement someday. You're making them happen faster than she ever dared. Did you know? I asked. About how my father treated her? About how little control he actually had? Patricia's expression grew guarded. We suspected. Catherine was careful, but there were signs for those paying attention. A few of us tried to provide her support where we could, but she shook her head. Corporate culture can be its own prison, especially for women of her generation. I thanked her for her candor and made a mental note to involve her more directly in the transition. Allies would be essential in the months ahead, particularly as my father inevitably escalated his attempts to undermine me. Sure enough, the following morning, I received a call from one of our largest commercial clients, a development firm that had worked exclusively with Wilson Family Enterprises for over a decade. Emma, the CEO began awkwardly, I've known your family for years, so I wanted to speak with you directly. Your father contacted me yesterday, suggesting that the company is in difficult straits since your mother's passing. He implied that our current contract might be at risk unless we allow him to remain our primary contact. I took a deep breath, centering myself before responding. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Peter. I can assure you that Wilson Family Enterprises is on solid ground. In fact, I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss expanding our relationship in ways that align with your sustainability goals, something I know is important to your board. The conversation that followed was the first of many similar discussions as I systematically reclaimed relationships my father had attempted to co-opt. With each call, each meeting, I grew more confident in my vision for the company and in my ability to implement it, despite the constant shadow of Richard Wilson's interference. That evening, exhausted but satisfied with the day's progress, I returned to the Hawthorne Street house. On the porch swing where my mother had spent countless hours planning her careful resistance, I opened my laptop to review the next day's agenda. A notification appeared, an email from an unfamiliar address with a subject line that made my heart race. What Catherine never told you. My finger hovered over the delete button, suspecting another of my father's tactics. But curiosity won out. I clicked to open it, unprepared for how the contents would force me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about my parents' marriage, my mother's choices, and the true cost of the legacy I'd inherited. The email sat open on my screen, its contents simultaneously illuminating and devastating. "I was your mother's assistant for 15 years, the message began. "What I witnessed during that time has weighed on my conscience, especially now that Catherine is gone. There are things you need to know, things she never told you about why she stayed with Richard, why she endured his behavior, and what finally pushed her to act. If you're willing to hear the full story, meet me at Riverside Cafe tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'll be wearing a red scarf." Eleanor Parks. My first instinct was to dismiss it as another manipulation, perhaps from my father or someone loyal to him. But something in the straightforward tone gave me pause. I remembered seeing the name Eleanor Parks on company documents, a longtime executive assistant who had retired shortly before my mother's diagnosis. A quick search confirmed she had indeed worked closely with Mom for many years. I replied, with a brief confirmation, then closed my laptop and walked to the kitchen, pouring a glass of wine with unsteady hands. Just when I thought I was beginning to understand my mother's complicated legacy, another layer revealed itself. How many more hidden facets of Catherine Wilson's life would I uncover? How many more revelations would force me to recalibrate my understanding of the woman who had raised me? Sleep eluded me that night, my mind cycling through memories of my parents' interactions, searching for clues I might have missed. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to hear what Eleanor Parks had to say, regardless of how it might further complicate my already tangled emotions. Riverside Cafe was a small establishment overlooking the park where Mom used to take me for weekend picnics when I was very young, before my father's resentment had calcified into the cold indifference that characterized my later childhood. I arrived early, securing a table with a view of both the entrance and the languid flow of the river beyond the windows. At precisely 2 p.m., a woman in her early 60s entered, scanning the room before her eyes settled on me. The promised red scarf was draped elegantly around her neck, a splash of color against her otherwise subdued attire. She carried herself with the poised efficiency of someone accustomed to navigating corporate environments, but her expression held something softer as she approached my table. "Emma," she said, extending her hand. "You look so much like her." "That's what people always said," I replied, gesturing for her to sit, though I never really saw it myself. "It's in the way you hold yourself," Eleanor observed, settling across from me. Catherine had that same watchfulness, always assessing, always strategizing. "Is that what you came to tell me?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. More about how my mother spent her life calculating instead of acting. Eleanor's expression remained gentle, unperturbed by my sharpness. "No, I came to tell you why." She ordered tea when the server approached, waiting until our drinks arrived before continuing, her voice lowered despite the ambient noise of the cafe. "I started working for your mother when you were just a toddler. She'd recently taken a more active role in the company after your grandfather's health began failing. Richard was already positioning himself as the face of Wilson Enterprises, but behind closed doors, Catherine was making the actual decisions." "So I've gathered," I said, thinking of the journals and financial records I'd been studying. "What you probably don't know is that she tried to leave him when you were 4 years old?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "What?" Eleanor nodded grimly. "She'd consulted a divorce attorney, secured an apartment, even enrolled you in a preschool near the new place. Everything was set." She took a sip of her tea, eyes distant with recollection. "Then Richard found out." "How?" "He had someone in the attorney's office, a paralegal he'd been sleeping with, ironically enough." Eleanor's mouth twisted. "He confronted Catherine in her office after hours. I was working late and heard everything from my desk outside." My heart pounded as I leaned forward. "What happened?" "He threatened to destroy her, not just take you," which was his first threat, but to systematically dismantle everything her father had built. He had compromising information on several board members, documentation of some ethically questionable decisions your grandfather had made. In the company's early days, nothing illegal, but enough to tarnish the Wilson name permanently if made public. I thought of my mother's careful journals, the detailed records of my father's manipulations. So she started keeping records of her own. Exactly. That night changed everything. She realized she wasn't just fighting for herself or even just for you. She was protecting her father's legacy, dozens of employees' livelihoods, community projects that depended on Wilson funding. Richard had effectively taken hostages. The server returned to refill our drinks, giving me a moment to process this new information. When we were alone again, I asked the question that burned most fiercely. But why not tell me any of this? When I was older? Why let me believe she was simply complicit? Eleanor's eyes filled with unexpected tears. That was my question too. For years I watched her endure his undermining, his affairs, his systematic campaign to diminish you both. I begged her to at least explain to you why she stayed, especially after you left for college, but she had convinced herself that knowing the truth would only burden you, that you would feel responsible for her choices. That wasn't her decision to make, I said, anger flaring anew. No, Eleanor agreed quietly. It wasn't. And in her final months, she came to the same conclusion. The cancer forced her to confront all the things she'd left unsaid, all the protections that had become prisons instead. She reached into her bag and withdrew a sealed envelope, sliding it across the table. She asked me to give you this if anything happened before she could tell you everything herself. I've kept it all these months, debating whether to honor that request or let sleeping dogs lie. But when I saw the announcement about your taking over as CEO, I knew you needed the full picture. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in my hands. My name was written on the front in my mother's elegant script, not her formal handwriting, but the relaxed cursive she used for birthday cards and notes in my lunchbox when I was small. There's one more thing you should know, Eleanor said, gathering her purse as if preparing to leave. Your mother didn't just document Richard's actions to protect the company. She was building a case to ensure he could never harm either of you again. The restructuring she implemented in the final 2 years wasn't just about securing your inheritance. It was preparation for finally ending her marriage. Oh, she was going to divorce him, I murmured, the realization dawning. Yes, she had a meeting scheduled with her attorney the week she was diagnosed. The cancer changed her timeline, but not her intention. Eleanor stood, adjusting her scarf. Read her letter, Emma. She may have failed you in many ways, but never in loving you. That was the one truth Richard could never twist, though God knows he tried. After Eleanor left, I sat motionless, the unopened letter before me, the afternoon light shifting across the table as time passed unnoticed. Around me, customers came and went, their conversations a distant hum beneath the roaring in my ears. Finally, I broke the seal. My dearest Emma, my mother's words began, by now you've likely discovered many of my secrets, the company maneuvers, the hidden studio, perhaps even this final letter through Eleanor. What you cannot discover on your own is the truth I've most shamefully hidden, how thoroughly your father's cruelty toward you was connected to his resentment of me. I paused, taking a steadying breath before continuing. When we married, Richard believed he was gaining control of the Wilson fortune. My father saw through him immediately, but worried that directly opposing the marriage would only strengthen my resolve. I was young and mistook Richard's ambition for passion. Instead, Dad structured his will to ensure the company would pass, only through blood relation, not marriage. Richard was furious when he discovered he would never truly own what he coveted. The next paragraphs detailed how my birth had cemented this arrangement. As the only Wilson heir, I represented everything my father had failed to acquire through marriage. His resentment, initially directed at my grandfather and mother, had expanded to include me from my earliest days. Each time he criticized your achievements, dismissed your intellect, or compared you unfavorably to others, he was really expressing his bitterness that you, not he, would eventually control everything he wanted. I recognized this pattern by your 5th birthday, and it was then I first attempted to leave him. My mother went on to describe what Eleanor had already revealed: the thwarted escape attempt, the threats, the hostages Richard had taken in the form of reputation and livelihoods. But she also detailed something Eleanor hadn't known: a second attempt when I was 16, triggered by a particularly vicious campaign my father had waged to undermine my confidence during college applications. He knew your acceptance to prestigious universities represented a step toward independence, both yours from his influence and eventually mine as well, once you were safely established in your own life. His response was to redouble his efforts to make you doubt your capabilities, to convince you that any success came not from your own merit, but from the Wilson name he so resented. Tears blurred my vision as I read about her second failed attempt to break free. This one stopped not by my father's threats, but by a sudden health crisis for my grandfather, who suffered a stroke that required my mother's full attention for months. By the time he stabilized, I had already left for college, and my mother had shifted strategies from escape to endurance with a new end goal: protecting my inheritance while maintaining enough peace to avoid triggering my father's nuclear option. What I never anticipated, she wrote, was how my silence would wound you as deeply as his criticism. In trying to shield you from the ugliest truths of our family dynamic, I became complicit in allowing you to believe his assessment of your worth. This is my greatest failure and deepest regret. You were never the disappointment, Emma. You were the hope I clung to, the reason I found strength to play this long, painful game of chess with a man who saw us both as pawns instead of queens. The final paragraphs revealed her diagnosis and the clarity it had brought, the recognition that time had run out for the carefully orchestrated exit she'd been planning. Cancer forced my hand in ways both terrible and clarifying. Faced with mortality, all the justifications for my silence crumbled. What good was preserving a legacy if I lost the opportunity to repair my relationship with you, to help you understand your true value? The restructuring of the company, the legal documents, the will, all were completed with an urgency born of knowing I might not have the chance to explain in person. Her closing words cut through years of misunderstanding with devastating simplicity. I hope someday you can forgive me for protecting the company more visibly than I protected your heart. I hope you'll understand that in my flawed way, I was fighting for your future freedom. Most of all, I hope you'll recognize that you never needed my protection to be extraordinary. You managed that all on your own, despite everything, Richard. And I did or failed to do. You are the best of the Wilson legacy, Emma, not because of what you've inherited, but because of who you've become in spite of us. All my love, always. Mom. I sat in that cafe until closing time, reading and rereading the letter until the words blurred together, each revelation shifting my understanding of the past 27 years. By the time I finally left, darkness had fallen, and with it came a strange, painful clarity. My mother had made terrible choices for understandable reasons. My father had waged a lifelong campaign of resentment against a child who represented everything he couldn't possess, and I had built my identity around proving myself worthy to people who had been fighting a battle I never fully understood. The next morning, I arrived at Wilson Family Enterprises headquarters earlier than usual, a new determination guiding my steps. In the executive suite that had once been my mother's and briefly my father's, I called the senior management team together for an unscheduled meeting. I want to discuss a special project, I announced once they had assembled, curiosity evident in their expressions. A complete audit of all company projects during my father's tenure as CEO, with particular focus on any that might have sidestepped ethical guidelines or regulatory requirements. James Thornton, who had emerged as a cautious ally, raised an eyebrow. That's extensive. May I ask why now? Because it's time for complete transparency, I replied evenly. My mother spent years privately correcting my father's maneuvers. I intend to address any remaining issues openly, even if it means short-term disruption. Mr. Wilson still has connections in this industry, another executive warned. Connections who might not appreciate having past arrangements scrutinized. I'm counting on it, I said, a cold smile forming. In fact, I'm hoping word of this audit reaches him quickly. I want Richard Wilson to understand exactly who he's dealing with now. The strategy was risky, potentially exposing vulnerabilities within the company while simultaneously challenging my father's remaining influence. But after reading my mother's letter, I'd realized something crucial. Continuing her pattern of secret corrections and quiet countermoves would keep me playing by the same rules that had constrained her. Breaking free meant changing the game. Entirely. By afternoon, my assistant reported receiving 3 calls from my father's new number, each message more agitated than the last. I let them go to voicemail, instead focusing on the document I was drafting, a comprehensive restructuring plan that would transform Wilson Family Enterprises from a traditional real estate development firm into a community-focused corporation with transparency and ethical practice at its core. As I worked, a strange sense of peace settled over me. For years, I'd interpreted my mother's acquiescence as weakness, my father's dominance as strength. Now I understood that real strength lay in neither silence nor control, but in the courage to rewrite the rules entirely. Catherine Wilson had played a defensive game masterfully, protecting what mattered at great personal cost. I would honor her sacrifice not by maintaining her approach, but by finishing what she'd started, creating a company that reflected the values she'd held privately but never fully implemented. That evening, as I prepared to leave the office, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Emma. My father's voice, tightly controlled but with an undercurrent of barely suppressed fury. We need to talk. About the audit? I asked calmly, continuing to gather my belongings as if this were any business call. Or about the board meeting. Next week where I'll be proposing a renaming of the company? The silence that followed told me I'd caught him off guard. Good. What are you doing? He finally asked, his tone shifting to the patronizing one he'd always used when he thought I was being impulsive or naive. The Wilson name has equity in this market. Changing it would be financial suicide. Actually, our market research suggests otherwise, especially once certain business practices under your leadership become public knowledge. I paused deliberately. Mom kept records, Dad, of everything. Another silence, this one heavier with implication. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its condescending edge. Whatever you think you know, I know enough, I interrupted. I know about the threatened divorce when I was 4. I know about the leveraged information you used to keep her in line. I know about the financial maneuvers she quietly corrected for years. Most importantly, I know exactly why you resented me from the moment I was born. His breathing had become audible, the only indication of his reaction. Here's what happens. Next, I continued, surprised by my own steady voice. You will cease all contact with our clients. You will stop attempting to undermine my leadership. You will accept the settlement outlined in Mom's will without contest. In return, I won't publicize the specific findings of our audit beyond what's legally required. You sound just like her, he said finally, bitterness evident in every syllable. Always thinking you're so clever. No, I corrected him. I'm not just like her. That's what you never understood about either of us. Mom played defense for 27 years, protecting what mattered while enduring your cruelty. I won't be doing that. Is that a threat? It's a promise, I replied. Simply, the difference between Catherine's approach and mine is that I'm not afraid of you, Dad. I never had the chance to know my grandfather, but I've spent weeks studying his vision for this company. I've spent years developing my own expertise in community development and organizational management. And I've spent a lifetime learning exactly how toxic leadership destroys potential. I could almost see him processing this, calculating his options as he always did. "One last thing," I added before he could respond. "At Mom's funeral, you called me a disappointment. Said that's all I'd ever been. I want you to know I finally understand that wasn't about me at all. It was your disappointment in failing to control what was never yours to begin with. I'm not carrying that weight anymore." Without waiting for his response, I ended the call and placed my phone in my bag, hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Outside my office window, the city skyline glittered in the early evening light, a view my mother had seen countless times while quietly battling the man who should have been her partner instead of her adversary. "I'm changing the rules, Mom," I whispered to the empty room. "I hope you'd approve." 6 months after that confrontation with my father, I stood at the podium in the newly renovated Wilson Community Center, the first completed project under my leadership and the symbolic heart of our company's transformation. The building, once a neglected property in my father's portfolio slated for luxury redevelopment, now housed affordable working spaces for local entrepreneurs, a childcare facility, and community meeting rooms. Behind me, a portrait of my mother and grandfather hung side by side, their legacy honored in more than just name. "Today we celebrate not just a building," I told the gathered crowd of employees, community members, and press, "but a new direction. Wilson Legacy Foundation is committed to development that serves community needs while creating sustainable growth." The renaming had been finalized 3 months earlier. Not Wilson Family Enterprises, with its implicit connection to my father, but Wilson Legacy Foundation, honoring the original vision while acknowledging our nonprofit status. The restructuring had been complex but surprisingly well received once our intentions became clear. Most of our commercial developments had been sold to finance the transition, with the proceeds establishing an endowment to support our new mission. As I spoke about future projects, my gaze fell on Olivia in the front row, her encouraging smile steadying me as it had throughout this challenging transformation. Beside her sat James Thornton, who had surprised everyone, including himself, by embracing our new direction with unexpected enthusiasm. "Turns out profit isn't the only motivator at my age," he'd confessed when agreeing to stay on as CFO despite the significant changes. Not everyone had made the transition with us. Several executives loyal to my father had resigned, along with board members uncomfortable with our pivot from pure profit to community impact. Their departures had created space for fresh perspectives, including Patricia Mercer, now our Chief Operating Officer, and Eleanor Parks, who had come out of retirement to serve as a special advisor during the restructuring. After the ceremony, as guests mingled at the reception, my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. I stepped into a quiet hallway to read it. "I saw the press coverage of your community center. Your grandfather would have approved. R. My father." After months of silence following our confrontation, this cryptic acknowledgement was unexpected. Not an apology, not quite a compliment, but something I never thought I'd receive from him. Recognition that I was honoring a legacy he had tried to redirect for his own purposes. I didn't respond. Some broken connections can't be repaired with a text message. Some wounds require more than vague acknowledgments to heal. But I couldn't deny the small measure of satisfaction his message provided, confirmation that he was watching as I rebuilt what he had tried to claim, reshape, and control. Later that evening, I returned to the house on Hawthorne Street, now, truly, my home in ways it hadn't been when I first moved in. I'd made changes, opening up the formal rooms, converting one space into a home office where I displayed my mother's paintings, selecting new furnishings that reflected my taste rather than preserved a museum to the past. Yet certain things remained untouched. Her studio upstairs, the garden she had lovingly tended, the photographs that told our complicated family story without hiding the difficult parts. In the carriage house that had been her sanctuary, I'd created my own retreat, not for secrets and escape as she had needed, but for reflection and creativity. The journals she'd kept now sat on open shelves rather than hidden in locked drawers. I'd added my own notebooks beside them, documenting not manipulations to counter, but visions to pursue. On my desk sat a framed photograph I'd discovered in her private papers. A picture of my mother as a young woman, standing proudly beside her father at the opening of their first major development. Her expression in that moment captured everything she'd later buried beneath accommodation and compromise: confidence, ambition, and an unmistakable sense of purpose. Beside it, I'd placed a more recent photo of myself at the Wilson Legacy Foundation launch, wearing an expression remarkably similar to hers in that earlier image. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, nor was the crucial difference. Where her path had narrowed over time, constrained by a marriage that became a trap, mine was expanding in directions she had only dreamed about. The inheritance she'd protected at such personal cost had become not just financial security, but the freedom to redefine success on my own terms. My phone rang, Olivia calling to check in after the event. "How are you feeling?" she asked when I answered. "That was quite a milestone today." "Good," I replied, surprised to find it was true. "Tired but good. I got a text from my father, actually." "What? What did he say?" I told her about his brief message and the strange sense of completion it had evoked, rather than the anger I might have expected even a few months earlier. "Does that mean you'll respond? Try to reconnect?" she asked cautiously. I considered the question, watching the sunset paint the garden in shades of gold. The same view my mother had contemplated during her own moments of decision. "No," I said finally. "Some relationships can't be rebuilt, but I think I'm reaching a place where his opinion, good or bad, doesn't define me anymore." After we hung up, I walked through the quiet house to my mother's studio, where I'd begun spending time each evening, not to paint as she had, but to write. Reflections, memories, plans for the foundation, occasionally even letters to her that I would never send, but that helped me process the complex legacy she'd left behind. Tonight, I felt drawn to write something different. Opening my journal to a fresh page, I began. "Dear Dad, I won't send this letter, just as I won't respond to your text. Some conversations are better had with ourselves than with those who lack the capacity to truly hear us. Your message today revealed something I've come to understand over these past months. Your approval was never what I needed. What I needed, what any child needs, was to be seen clearly and valued unconditionally. Mom failed me in her way, choosing protection over truth, preservation over confrontation. You failed me by making your resentment of her choices my burden to bear. Between these two imperfect parents, I somehow found my way to a truth neither of you fully grasped. Legacy isn't what we inherit, but what we choose to build with what we're given. The community center bearing the Wilson name represents values you never embraced. The foundation Mom protected, and I've transformed honors a vision you tried to redirect. The woman I've become emerged not because of your criticism or in spite of it, but through the gradual recognition that your assessment was never about my worth at all. At Mom's funeral, you called me a disappointment in front of everyone we knew. It was your final verdict after a lifetime of similar judgments. What you'll never understand is that the moment you spoke those words was the moment they lost their power to wound me. In that public cruelty, I finally saw clearly what Mom had recognized years before, that your opinion reflected nothing about me and everything about your own failures. I don't forgive you. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But I'm also no longer defined by the need for that forgiveness to heal. The lawyer revealed who inherited everything that day, but what he couldn't reveal was the most valuable inheritance of all, the freedom to determine my own worth. I closed the journal, not needing to finish the letter. Its purpose wasn't communication, but release, letting go of the last remnants of a dynamic that had shaped me without defining me. Standing at the window of the studio my mother had created as her refuge, I watched the last light fade from the garden she had tended through years of quiet rebellion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, board meetings, development proposals, community partnerships to nurture. The path I was forging looked nothing like either of my parents had envisioned, yet carried elements of both their influences: my mother's strategic vision, my father's determination, transformed by my own distinct perspective. "The best revenge is not being like your enemy," I murmured, recalling a quote that had sustained me through the darkest moments of this transformation. My father had spent decades trying to claim what wasn't his. My mother had spent years protecting what she valued at great personal cost. I would spend my life building something new from what they had left behind, something neither could have imagined, but both had, in their very different ways, made possible. The inheritance wasn't just the company, the properties, the financial security. It was the clarity that came from finally understanding the complicated truth of my family's dynamics. It was the freedom to choose which legacies to honor and which to leave behind. It was the recognition that worth isn't bestowed by parents, or partners, or anyone external. It's an inherent truth we either acknowledge or deny in ourselves and others. As darkness fell completely, I switched on the studio light and looked at my mother's paintings one last time before heading downstairs. Tomorrow would be soon enough to continue building the future. Tonight was for acknowledging how far I'd already come, from the wounded daughter standing at her mother's funeral to the confident woman charting her own course through a legacy complex enough to contain both pain and possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.